Well, hello there. You're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. Time then to see what's making the headlines with the broadcaster and commentator, Andreou, and the parliamentary sketch writer for the Daily Telegraph, Madeline Grant, with us from now until just before midnight. And welcome, great to see both of you. So to the front pages then, let's start with the Eye, which claims rail bosses are still getting a bonus despite cancelling up to 200 trains a day. The FT leads with US inflation falling again in November, sending stock prices up on Wall Street, closing at a record high. The Archbishop of Canterbury will be knighted by King Charles in his upcoming New Year's honours list, according to the Daily Mail. Sir James Dyson tells the Telegraph the UK needs to focus on growth rather than cutting inflation, praising the policies of Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. The Guardian says Labour is considering scaling back plans to borrow £28 billion a year to invest in green jobs and industry because of fears the Conservatives will attack the policy in the general election campaign. The Times reports ministers are pushing for live facial recognition cameras to be used in town centres after trials found they can catch criminals in a fraction of the time that it would otherwise take. The front of the Express features Esther Ranson again, thanking readers for their support as she's battling to legalise assisted dying. The Daily Mirror says travellers are facing a Christmas getaway from hell as road, rail, sea and air chaos even hit the nation this weekend. That is also the lead for the Daily Star with the headline, "Are we nearly there yet?" A reminder, by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us. I'm going to reflect on the festiveness of Saturday's front pages in a moment, but first of all to the substantive matters. And Alex, that vote at the UN, finally, one might say, backing further aid, but not using the word ceasefire, does make the front of the Guardian.
Yes, no, they only said that they want to create the conditions for a ceasefire. And there is a ratcheting of the language, and there is a promise of acceleration of aid, and I think quite significantly, the appointment of a UN coordinator on the ground to facilitate all of that. I mean, I guess it comes back to the question, would it be better to have a stronger resolution that didn't pass or a weaker resolution that does pass? You know, the old adage that if a diplomat says yes, they mean maybe. If they say maybe, they mean no. And if they say no, then they're no diplomat. And I guess the no is what they were trying to avoid here. They were trying desperately to find something to which everyone could say yes. So I think it is minuscule steps, but progress.
There were more abstentions last time, weren't there, including, the UK. So, in a sense, the US is on its own in trying to hold back this idea of an urgent ceasefire. Would that worry them, do you think? Or is it just, they've got Israel's back and that's the way it is?
Would that worry Israel? Yes. Well, I think absolutely it would. This is... They rely very heavily on support from their historic allies, particularly the USA. And actually, Israel may be able to say, for example, truthfully, that the UN has a real problem with Israel, disproportionate actually to any other country in the world. They have more resolutions condemning Israel than any other country in the world, and they would argue that that shows that some of this is an unfair preoccupation with Israel. However, when that criticism is coming from friendly nations, it is much harder to simply dismiss it out of hand.
Well, Russia, also critical. The UN ambassador called the resolution entirely toothless, accused the United States of shameful, cynical and irresponsible conduct, resorting to tactics of gross pressure, blackmail and twisting arms to avoid a US veto. Of course, the US ambassador absolutely defended it, saying that, it wasn't toothless at all. It was tough, but we got there. And certainly there seems to have been, at least a week and a half of high-level diplomacy, not just at the UN, in Doha and Cairo. It was a tough effort to get there, wasn't it?
The vote was delayed actually twice in order to get there. It was meant to happen on Tuesday morning. And so, yes, you do get a sense of that process. But I think the whole conversation around this somehow proceeds from the notion that if the UN said, you must cease fire, Israel would go, okie dokie then. They just wouldn't. And so it would create actually a worse deadlock than there is now. it is a ghastly situation, and a lot of innocent people are dying. But the point is that in order to get to a position for peace, it has to be that both parties in this conflict want it. It can't be because the international community wants it. That doesn't get us there. It has to be because the two parties involved in the conflict are ready to stop fighting.
Well, Hamas' reaction tonight, this is a predictable reaction, I guess. It says that it is an insufficient step, doesn't meet the requirements of the catastrophic state caused by the military machine in Gaza. And, of course, a report released by 23 UN agencies, humanitarian agencies, suggested that the entirety of Gaza's 2.2 million population was in a food crisis or worse, and that more than 550,000 are at the catastrophic starvation level. So that's the urgent part of this, to get the aid in, and in greater quantity as well.
It's absolutely harrowing and terrifying, but it is a bit rich to hear of Hamas talking about the injustice of the situation that they caused by launching the assault on October the 7th, and that they could end by handing over the hostages and laying down their weapons.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we'll certainly keep an eye on how quickly aid gets in, whether there is a further deal to get the hostages out as well, and if this move towards a cessation of hostilities actually happens as well. In the meantime, let us move to the UK economy. We heard word today that, in fact, we are teetering on zero growth, are we not, at the moment? And this is an intervention, Madeline, by Sir James Dyson, who, and we heard this during the Liz Truss era, didn't we, that brief era, that he wants to focus on growth, not inflation. Yes. The sense that squeezing inflation depresses the economy, and actually it's now time to reverse that.
Yes, which is quite easy to say when we've fallen from over 10% now to just under 4%. We are sitting prettier now than we were in terms of inflation, but obviously the economy is still in a parlous state. And I think that although, I agree with some of what James Dyson says here, I think perhaps invoking Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng is not the wisest move, given that, they didn't exactly invent the idea of growth and low taxes, and there are many other people who are not so discredited who are also making these points. So to set them up as the unique flag bearers of pro-growth in Britain seems to me a mistake. But I think he does make some interesting points. He says that wealth generation and growth did become dirty words. And I think that is fair to say when you look at how, for a long time, this has been undervalued in all sorts of ways, and not least our inability to build anything. That, to me, suggests a country that is quite willing to shoot itself in the foot. Rishi Sunak's obviously got all of his targets, of which he's not meeting most of them, apart from the halving of inflation. But many people have said, why don't you just fix certain things? For example, get a deal with doctors in order to at least get the NHS functioning as well. Whether we get more tax cuts as well in the spring budget, would that, push growth? Is it time to move away from this focus
practical
of
solutions, I think, is what's lacking, instead of grand ideological statements, prioritise this versus that. We are now in the fourth round, I think this is, of getting one set of data that kind of goes in the right direction. Sometimes it's growth, but inflation goes the other way. Sometimes we get good news on inflation, but growth goes the other way. And that's because those two things are related. They're a seesaw. If you're trying to suppress inflation, you will suppress growth, and vice versa. So, I think what's needed is a little bit of realism and a little less of saying, if the data is good, our plan is working. If the data is not good, this proves we must stick to the plan. And you hear that and you think, well, what would convince you then to tweak the plan? Because you take positive data to mean that it's working and negative data to mean that you must do it harder.
Yes. And whether there's a lag, you put interest rates up and only slowly do you get the things. So whether the lag is already there, whether actually inflation will already fall, but, who knows? But interest rates will still be slow to fall next year.
Also, it is just quite worrying, isn't it, that we seem unable to make very important predictions that will inform public policy, that they so often appear to be completely out of whack. People make decisions based on that wrongness.
I mean, in their defence...
And then we play catch-up.
In their defence, this is because this particular crisis is being driven by so many external factors that whatever predictions they make, they won't affect the fact, that ships now stopped collecting oil from the Red Sea.
Yeah.
How will that impact inflation in 2 or 3 months?
You're quite right, because it shouldn't be a sort of coming in with the tablets of stone.
No.
I think these things should be taken with a pinch of salt.
My old economics professor used to call it a wobble board. You have to balance, you know, like in the gym, you have to balance, and the only way you can do that is by having a strong core.
Yes. And the whole point is that
that
the Bank of England was criticised at the start of this by pushing up interest rates probably too slowly, and actually suggested its modelling might have been wrong. So that's you know, that doesn't give you so much confidence, does it? In that. Anyway, let's go to the Daily Mail. I have to say, there's a very festive theme to lots of these newspapers, apart from Wham on the front, which no doubt we'll get to. You know, there's a lot of you know, your 2-week TV guides and your how to cook a turkey. And Madeline, it's worth, you know, somebody who's in the newspaper industry, this is a really big selling weekend, isn't it, for the papers, don't you think? Getting all these extra bits out there for everybody.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, because people go home and they finally have a bit more time to sit and read things. And puzzles always do extremely well, because it's something that families can do together. Once you've run out of small talk. It's certainly what we do in my family.
And the New Year quiz.
And the New Year's quiz,
exactly.
yes.
But at the moment,
All
it's the TV guide, which obviously... But anyway, let's go to the Daily Mail, which is Charles tonight, Archbishop Welby. And, of course, we've got the New Year's honours coming up, haven't we?
Yes, that's right. And the Archbishop of Canterbury is to be knighted by the King for his personal service to the Crown. So this was not in the kind of politician honours, this was in the King's birthday honours. And this is an interesting story, because on the one hand, Justin Welby is obviously a public servant of great standing. He's been Archbishop now for 10 years, and he was heavily involved in the coronation of the King. However, at the same time, you know, there has been a lot of criticism, obviously, from the Conservative Party, but many people in the Church of England have been highly critical of Justin Welby too, for what some see as a kind of technocratic approach to the job, and also for his decisions during lockdown, where there was great criticism of the decision to not just prevent church services from happening in the normal way, but even preventing priests from actually going into their own church on their own and just praying for their congregation there. Many people felt that went way too far. So this is an interesting choice, but actually not really that controversial for someone who's been doing it for such a long time.
Well, such a long time, but also with seismic moments, you know, for the royal family. The death of one monarch and the coronation of another. They would have interacted so much more than you would normally expect to see.
That's true, actually. They would have got to know each other very, very well. I mean, I guess you could flip this subline, King honours man who crowned him, despite his attacks on Tories. You could flip it and say, well, what would he do? Not knight him because he's been quite political, because that would seem to be the most political move of all. You know, he's clearly earned his dues, a lot more than some people that we see being honoured and elevated to the Lord.
We have to remember, you've got a monarch who's trying to suppress their own political, you know, interventions, haven't you? So
Good, doing a great job,
probably understand, I think, probably. In the meantime, let's go to The Guardian. Labour may curtail its Green Plan to avert Tory attacks. This is fascinating, isn't it? Because they already feel like they've scaled it back in terms of time frame. Labour considering scaling back ambitious plans to borrow £28 billion a year to invest in green jobs and industry. So anybody voting for Labour, hoping to get more net zero ambition, might be disappointed, Alex.
And it's interesting that 2 days ago I was reading a story about Labour being in contact with the White House, and the strategists for Biden there, giving them advice from their experience of the last American presidential election, saying, you have to make yourselves as small a target as possible. That is the name of the game, to give as little to attack. Don't worry about anything policy-wise. The name of the game is to make the target as small as possible, and I think this is what's happening here.
But see, Biden could do that because it was a COVID year, and if he wasn't making appearances all the time, then actually that felt acceptable. Whether it will going into 2024, you know, who knows? But certainly that does, you know, that is what the advice to Labour has been, isn't it? You know, go small, as it were.
Yes, and also keep the purse strings as tight as possible. This is Rachel Reeves's big thing. You know, there have been a few occasions where Labour ministers shadow ministers have gone on the radio and they've kind of said they've misspoken and promised some kind of spending pledge that's not actually been approved by Rachel Reeves, and then they've come down hard on them again. This is that they're trying to be very careful, but it does sort of beg the question of, you know, what is politics for. If we end up with, you know, Rachel Reeves is basically doing an identical economic policy to what the Conservatives are currently doing now, is that really going to animate people? You know, you get Jeremy Hunt in a wig, you know. But on the one hand, it's interesting that they fear the Conservative attacks, supposedly, as much as they do, given the state of the polls. But on the flip side, you could argue that perhaps the state of the polls has emboldened them now because they don't have to say, for example, if we upset the left of our party, we don't have to worry about it as much as we might have done if we weren't 20 points ahead in the polls.
Yeah, and this idea of sort of effectively going limp in terms of policy and not coming out, not out, does that force the Tories to flush themselves out and bring in those dividing lines like Rwanda, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the Tories need any help. They just need Labour to stay out of it while they're having this bun fight. But there is another aspect to this, which is, I think, after the years we've had, I think people are quite cynical about policy promises.
Yeah.
And so to a large extent, you're in a hiding to nothing to make a big costed policy promise, which everyone can then attack. And if people don't believe you will deliver it anyway, I think COVID, Ukraine, what they prove is that whoever goes into number 10 has to throw the plan out pretty much on week 2. And what they're interested to know is what are your priorities, what are your values, rather than specific costed policies.
Yeah, it's a firefighting job, isn't it?
It's a sort of vibes election.
Yeah, we'll have to get a manifesto at some point.
How terribly depressing.
Anyway, lots more still to come, including this on the front of the eye. UK's worst rail firms cancel 200 trains a day, that is, but bosses still take their bonuses. This is after the prices go up too. Back with that in just a moment. Hello there, welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me once again, commentator and broadcaster Andreou and the parliamentary sketch writer for the Daily Telegraph, Madeline Grant. Welcome to both of you. Parliament's off and you're still here, still working, so that's, grateful for that.
Just about.
Losers, that's what you're trying to say.
No, not at all. No. So let's go to the Eye weekend, which is all about rail, on a day where England found out its fares were going up by 4.9%, I suppose predictable because of inflation, but we're still seeing 200 trains a day cancelled, and the Eye, the subject of their article is that, you know, bosses are still taking their bonuses, Madeline.
This is the thing, you know, 4.9% is a kick in the teeth at the best of times, especially if you're a commuter who has a season ticket and it's already a big part of your day-to-day expenses. But, you know, it'd be one thing if the trains at least ran on time and they were kind of vaguely hospitable places, but it's sort of like you pay through the nose every year to have a kind of, you know, the cattle cart experience. I'm travelling back home tomorrow morning by train and I'm sort of hoping it's not going to be too awful. But it really is shocking. I also wonder if, you know, they may actually, by constantly putting up the prices, these rail bosses may be slightly signing their own death warrant, because already, you know, working from home has exploded over the last few years. And if you make commuting that unpleasant, I expect you will find that there are more and more people who start to demand and look for jobs where they can work from home more. So the revenues will go down even further.
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult, isn't it? Because obviously there's the rush at certain times of the day still, but the rest of the schedule still has to be run, even if the trains are half or even a quarter empty. So this is the great dilemma of public transport, isn't it?
Yesterday, every single train was cancelled out of Paddington, I think, because there was a bag up on the overhead cables, a sort of shopping bag, blue on the overhead, and every train was cancelled. And all of this adds up. It adds up to a sort of general grumbling and agitation. I don't commute, but I know from everyone that commutes that their sense is that it's never been as bad. That every time you step on a train, you sort of take life in your hands and you don't know whether you will end up stuck in a field.
Well, you'd have staff shortages and staff sickness as well, wouldn't you,
yes,
through the COVID part. I'm just going to move on, if you don't mind, I haven't got that long. Daily Express are going on Esther Rantzen again and the idea of assisted dying, you know, thanking people who've given support when she needs it most, Madeline.
Yes, so Esther Rantzen has this week launched a new campaign to legalise assisted dying, and she's suffering from stage 4 lung cancer. I think she's a very brave and national treasure, really. And it is such a complex and difficult issue. I mean, I'm personally, I think, I always am very aware that for every case, I worry that for every case like Esther Rantzen, where you have someone who is worrying about having a terrible death full of pain at the end of their life, who's in complete control of their senses and knows exactly what they want. I worry, though, that there may also be people who are not in that frame of mind, who might come under pressure. I really worry about the unintended consequences, where in Canada, where assisted dying came in a few years ago, this extraordinary slippery slope has occurred where now almost 5% of all deaths that occur in Canada are happening with MAID, as it's called. And it includes people for things like people who can't get welfare support, people who are homeless and this kind of thing. So we need to have a public debate about this because it's very popular, but we really need to think about what the safeguards might be that could protect against that.
We've run out of time. I just want to show you the final picture we were going to do, which is on the front of the Daily Telegraph, which is, of course, that Last Christmas is finally a Christmas #1 for Wham. Last Christmas #1. We'll talk about that, no doubt, next hour. Alex and Madeline, thank you both so much. Thank you. See you for the 11. Right now, here's the weather.